Hey guys! This evening I'm going to be talking about Andy Lee Park and Hayden Duran. We're going to go over the basics of the case, just in case you missed the intro briefing on Thursday or Saturday. So, as you may know, every year mock trial is given a case, and our case for this year is Andy and Lee Park versus Hayden Duran. One thing to note about this case, it's a civil case, which is different from cases that we've had in the past. I'll be talking more about the specifics of civil cases later. So, have you had a chance to read the case packet? Maybe a little? Well, we realize that not everybody has time for that. That's why we have this briefing. Who is Sydney Park? Sydney Park is unfortunately the victim in our case. Sydney Park was an 11-year-old girl who was left at home with her best friend Jessie Duran. She and Jessie Duran had been friends since they were 5 years old. They had lived together, played together, hung out together since they had been toddlers. Both their parents were good friends as well. Hayden Duran and Andy and Lee Park often hung out together and talked a lot about their children together. But that friendship eventually ended in tragedy. One day, when Sydney Park and Jessie Duran were over at the Parks household, unsupervised, tragedy struck. Jessie shot Sydney. This is an undisputed fact. Notice I'm not using alleged here. It is an undisputed fact that Jessie shot Sydney that morning. Jessie was discovered later that day, sitting in a chair, staring blankly at the wall, with the pistol he had shot Sydney with laying in front of him. Now, the purpose of this trial and the purpose of this case is to determine whether or not Jessie intentionally shot Sydney, or if negligence on the part of Hayden Duran, Jessie's mother or father, brought Sydney's death. So you notice here we have our picture of Sydney. Sydney is a brown-eyed, brown-haired girl, about 11 years old. We are entering this picture into evidence as Exhibit 17 as the optional picture. So yes, we plan on using this as a demonstrative. And for all intents and purposes, this is the girl who will be Sydney all season. So, you might have heard me mention that you can go for either or. Well, Complaint 1 is the first version of the case that we have to present to the court. Complaint 1 is the negligent parent. This is being levied against Hayden Duran specifically because the Parks believe that it was negligence on the part of Hayden Duran that brought about Sydney's death. They believe that Hayden Duran did not do enough to prevent Jessie's interest in guns and interest in violence. Now, keep in mind, we will have to prepare a case theory for both Complaint 1 and Complaint 2 on both the plaintiff and the defense sides of the case. So before you create your case theory, you need to be able to argue both for and against on both complaints. So Complaint 1, in order to prove or disprove, you have to show that the parent knew or should have known and should have prevented bodily harm to another. 2, parent failed to exercise reasonable control of the child. 3, the parents lack of ability to exercise reasonable control created physical harm. 4, that harm was a direct and proximate action of the parent's minor. Now, we know that Jesse shot Sydney. We know that in Jesse shooting Sydney, he created physical harm. So points 3 and 4 are not arguable. They are decided before you walk into that courtroom. Keep that in mind when you're designing your case theory. Complaint 2, intentional shooting. Now, in order to prove or disprove the intentional shooting complaint, you have to show that Jesse intentionally, with the purpose of, and knowing that it was substantially likely that it would hurt Sydney, shot Sydney. You have to prove that Jesse had causation to shoot Sydney. You have to prove that Jesse created physical harm to Sydney. And that harm was a direct and proximate action of Jesse. Jesse is being represented by his parent, Hayden Duran. So Hayden Duran is given all liability for both of these complaints. I'm going to go deeper into the case law later, but just so you have a basic rundown of what this case is and what you need to prove and what you need to disprove so you can get started on your case theory, I hope that this helped out a little bit. So, for this case, because it's a civil case, the burden of proof is the preponderance of evidence. Basically, what this means is that it's a lesser burden of proof than a criminal case, which you may know because it's a very common phrase. Most criminal cases must be proven beyond the reasonable doubt. Now, for this case in particular, in order to win on both complaints, you have to prove that based on preponderance of evidence, the plaintiff should be given adequate restitution for the events that occurred. That's all you have to prove. So, you may see right here, we have a very good article that you can click on. This just goes more in depth, into the preponderance of evidence, what this actually means, just in case you're a little unclear. Basically, to sum up in layman's terms, preponderance of evidence means that you just have to show that there's enough evidence there that the plaintiff is worthy of restitution. So right here you have some for fun videos. We're going to watch them. So for those of you that are new to mock trial, you may feel a bit like this guy. But that's okay.
Duran, on January 4th of this year, my client did indeed visit the Sackerson's convenience store.
But that's okay. You know why it's okay? Because the reason why we have practices is to make you learn how to speak. To make you more comfortable getting up in front of people and arguing your point and protecting your clients. So, hopefully, by the end of the season, by the time we roll around to regionals, you'll feel more like this attorney.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
I'd like an answer to the question, Judge.
Court will wait for an answer.
If Lieutenant Kimmick even that Santiago wasn't to be touched, Why did he have to be Colonel? Lieutenant Kendrick ordered the code red, didn't he? Because that's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do.
Object! And when it went bad, you cut these guys loose! Your Honor, you had markers inside a phony transport! Your Honor, you doctored the logbook! Damn it, Captain! You coerced the doctor!
Consider yourself in contempt.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
So, don't be worried if you're a little bit confused how to go about your case right now. That's why we have practices. That's why we have these videos. That's why me and the other officers are here, as well as Commander Sherry and Lieutenant Commander Adler. We're here to help you learn. To help you learn how to win. So, lastly, before I conclude this video, I'm going to go over the major lay witnesses in the case. Notice that this list does not include the expert witnesses. Why? For the purpose of training our witnesses, I am more concerned about developing the lay witnesses first. This is because the lay witnesses have more of a personality on the stand, and their personality affects how we will deal with them. Expert witnesses are included more so for their testimony, and the people playing the expert witnesses are given less leeway because the expert witnesses really are only there for what they say versus how they portray themselves. In short, it's more important for us to determine how our actors are going to act out the lay witnesses than the expert witnesses. So we're going to focus on them first, excuse me. Okay, so you may notice Sydney Park is listed on here. Obviously, she is not a playable character because she's sort of dead. But it is essential for us to understand in our case theory how we're going to portray Sydney Park before we go into the trial. There are multiple ways we can portray Sydney Park, as I hope you will see when you're reading the affidavits. You can portray her as the ultimate victim in this case, the one who was bullied into opening the safe, into playing with the gun, into giving Jesse the gun, if you want to paint Jesse as the evil one. Or you can portray her as the one who was equally interested in violence, equally interested in those violent video games, equally interested in deliberately disobeying her parents, going into the file cabinet which had the safe code written in it, unlocking the safe, and for the sake of curiosity, playing with the gun. Ultimately, both portrayals of her end in tragedy. So, we'll talk about how we want to portray Sydney Park in subsequent practices. But just so you know, that's a very brief summary of two options of how she can be portrayed. Now, Jesse Duran is our next one. Jesse Duran is a very interesting and dangerous character. Now, I say he's dangerous, and I'm going to refer to him as a he right now for the sake of simplicity. I know he can be both a female or a male, depending on who is playing him. But the reason why I think Jesse Duran is dangerous is his testimony. He gives conflicting testimony throughout each of the times he appears in the case packet. You have his handwritten note that he wrote just after killing Sydney, which I'll give you guys the opportunity to look at it for yourself so I don't put words in your mouth, but I think you'll agree with me in that when you compare that handwritten statement to his later dispositions and his later affidavit, it's not good. Now, that gets rid of both portrayals that I can see occurring for Jesse. That The fact that his testimony is contradictory kind of leads me to believe that we want him to plead the fifth and not appear in court, regardless of how we portray him. Now, just like Sydney Park, there are two major ways that you can portray Jesse Duran, in my opinion. Jesse Duran can be portrayed as a bully, one who was overly interested in video games, one that got kicked out of school for a period of time, one that Sydney's babysitter thought was a bad influence on Sydney, one who called his father or mother, his parent, Voldemort in his phone. Basically, you could paint him as a sociopath if you wanted to. Now, there is another way to paint him. You can paint Jesse Duran as the best friend of Sydney Park. Probably the only friend of note that she had. You could paint Jesse as this boy just like any other, one who played the normal boy video games, who really did not have any desire to hurt his best friend, the one he spent the majority of his time with, the one who knew, because his parent had coached him multiple times, knew the dangers of weapons and the dangers of guns. How you develop your case theory is up to you. How you want to paint Jesse Duran and Sydney Park is up to you. I'm just offering a couple suggestions. Now, Hayden Duran is the parent of the shooter. Notice I do not refer to Jesse as the alleged shooter. That's because there's no alleged in this case. We know he was the shooter of Sydney Park. That is an undisputable fact, unfortunately. Now, Hayden Duran is a reasonably upstanding member of society. He works for the local hospital, he's educated, he's informed, he cares quite a bit about his son. I'm also referring to Hayden Duran as a he here for simplicity's sake. Hayden Duran is the only parent of Jesse. Jesse was a test tube baby, basically. So Hayden Duran is the only one who can be held liable for Jesse's actions. Hayden testifies that he coached Jesse on the dangers of weapons, that yes, he did permit Jesse to play violent video games, that yes, he did allow Jesse to go over to the Parks household the day of Sydney's death without adult supervision on the Parks residence. He also testifies that he did not feel comfortable permitting Jesse and Sydney to stay over at the Parks household alone, especially with knowledge of the Parks having a weapon on the premises. It was the Parks who he alleges that said that the weapon, because it was locked in a safe, was of no danger to their children. Unfortunately, that did not end up being the case. Danny Brooks is another important lay witness in the case. Danny Brooks was the babysitter of Sydney Park. Danny was not present or supposed to be present at the time of the incident. He, again, I'm referring to him as he for the case of simplicity before anybody jumps at me. He was having some significant family issues and was not able to babysit Sydney and Jesse that day. The only reason Danny's testimony is present in the case is to show Danny's disposition towards Jesse before the shooting. Danny, in short, hated Jesse. He believed that Jesse was a bad influence on Sydney and would eventually cause her harm. He also believed that Jesse was a bully and overly interested in violence and weapons. The next important lay witness is Andy Park, parent of Sydney. Andy Park is important for obvious reasons. You will have to be careful in crossing Andy Park in that Andy Park is labeled as a grieving witness. You will have to exercise special courtesy when dealing with Andy because Andy is still grieving for his daughter. Now, Andy Park obviously thinks that Hayden Duran and Jesse Duran are in the wrong. He specifically alleges that Jesse Duran is evil. Now, keep in mind he has a bias because his daughter was shot by Jesse Duran, but we can argue the merits of his bias later. The last important lay witness is Dale Williams, police officer. Dale Williams is important because he was the first police officer on the scene. And in being the first police officer on the scene, he was the first to have a look at the evidence. He was the one who found Jesse sitting in the chair. His testimony is very matter of fact. You can use it, I believe, to support both the plaintiff side and the defense side. Now, one of the lay witnesses that is not listed on here is Terry Chapman. The reason why Terry Chapman is not listed on here is because he is an unreliable witness. He's the drunkard next door. He says that the morning that Sydney was found dead, he heard a gunshot. And in being the upstanding neighbor that he was, he put on his clothes and walked over and found Sydney dead and Jesse standing over her. Terry Chapman is an unreliable witness because he says that he drank 10 vodka Red Bulls 10 hours before he discovered Sydney and Jesse in the scene. Terry Chapman was the one who called the police and started the whole thing. So basically that's it for today. I hope that helped you out. I would like to know what you guys think of these video briefings. I apologize for my pauses, and if you found this to be rambling at all. I'll be following this up next week with lesson 1. I hope you all have a great day and a great week, and go Bears.